Welcome to Bible class this morning as we dive into this whole topic of eugenics. And the class today is really going to focus on what eugenics is. What is the eugenics movement? So eugenics, an introduction. And before we get into what it really is, I want to talk about an instance where this word, if you've never heard of eugenics before, we'll talk more about it, but this word is a Greek word. It comes from two Greek words put together, and we'll talk about that, but because it's a Greek word, you can actually search through the New Testament that was written in Greek, and you can ask, does this Greek word eugenics show up in the Bible? And as it turns out, it does. So for a little bit of an opening devotion, I want to go to the next slide, and we will read from 1 Corinthians chapter 1. All right, so beginning at verse 26 of 1 Corinthians. For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God shows what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God shows what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God shows what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. And because of him, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption, so that, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. And I share this selection from 1 Corinthians with you because although you might not have heard the word eugenics, the word eugenic is in there. And it is in verse 26 where Paul is listing these different characteristics of things that you are not. You know, not many of you are wise, not many were powerful, not many were of noble birth. And that word there translated as noble birth is this word that we're considering this morning, eugenic or eugenics. And so Paul is saying that not many of you were eugenic. Not many of you were eugenically born, were of noble birth, as our ESV translation translates it. So the basic point of this, of sharing this from 1 Corinthians, is that Paul is teaching us what grounds we have to boast before the Lord. How is it that we can actually boast before God? And so you ask yourself, how can you do this? Is it because of your size and strength and ability, your wisdom, even having a noble birth or a good birth, being born into the right type of family? No, Paul says this is not our reason for boasting before the Lord. Our reason for boasting is rather to be found in our Lord Jesus Christ. It is in Jesus Christ that we have wisdom, righteousness, sanctification, and redemption. He is our reason for boasting, not anything that is in us. And so, before the Lord, before each other, we do not boast in ourselves, but rather we boast in Jesus Christ, who is our redemption. Now, it should also be noted here that Moses, in his sermon to the Israelites in Deuteronomy, as they're about to cross over the Jordan River and take the promised land that God had promised them, Moses underscores this point in Deuteronomy chapter 7 when he says that it is not because of your size or your strength, it's not because of your righteousness that God has chosen you, but rather he has chosen you because of his love and faithfulness, or as St. Paul says, he has chosen you because of Jesus Christ, your redemption. So that is an interesting kind of biblical example where this word eugenics shows up in the Bible. Now let's get into the study about what eugenics is. And I put together a little outline for the class. So if you didn't get one of those, please make sure to pick one up. That will help guide you through this study together and guide our thinking on this whole topic about what is eugenics. Okay, so eugenics, it goes back to the 1800s, this movement called eugenics. It was founded, the movement of eugenics was founded by a man named Francis Galton, who you see pictured there on the screen. Francis Galton, it should be said, was a very talented and intelligent man. He was one of these noble birth type men. He was born into the likes of the Darwin family. He's actually Charles Darwin's cousin. And as we'll see as we go on, there is more connection between eugenics and Darwinian evolution than just the fact that these two men, Galton and Darwin, were cousins. There's much deeper connection there. Anyway, Francis Galton was a very intelligent man, so he did pioneering work in the fields of meteorology, statistics, even fingerprinting. He was a very intelligent man, so he contributed kind of foundational work to these different fields here, but he had a broad-ranging interest, and he was interested in numbers and counting things. So one of the things that he was counting was kind of the prevalence of intelligence or beauty or even moral character that was in populations. And he's from England. So in England in the late 1800s, he was making these observations. And he started to come up with this idea of eugenics. 1883 is when the first time he used that term, eugenics. It eventually caught on and became much more prevalent. But 1883, Francis Galton noticed that certain traits seem to stay within families. So if you have, say, a poor family, it seems that the children remain poor and their children remain poor. Or if you have a very well-to-do family, rich, upper crust, their children remain rich, upper crust, and so on and so forth, almost as if it's passed on biologically. And so this is the idea of eugenics. And again, it comes from this Greek word, eu meaning good, and genesis meaning birth, eugenics. Now, you might have heard of another term, euthanasia, which is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum from eugenics. Eugenics means good birth, euthanasia means good death. And you're probably familiar with that term from kind of modern discussion of that topic. So, nevertheless, eugenics means good birth. So let's dive in a little bit more into what exactly this eugenic concept is. So next slide, please. So this is an official definition of eugenics from Francis Galton himself. And Galton was citing this definition from various other prominent places within what became the eugenics community. He defines eugenics officially as the study of agencies under social control that may improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, either physically or mentally. So the aim of the eugenics movement was to improve the physical and mental quality of future generations using what he says, agencies under social control. Basically, what that ended up meaning was political influence. But agencies under social control to improve the health, the mental and physical health of future generations. Now, this eugenics, it saw itself as specifically advancing human evolution. And this image of the eugenic tree there was one of the logos of a large meeting of eugenicists in 1921. This is an even more succinct definition of eugenics. Eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. So what they're saying there is that they saw eugenics as the practical application of evolutionary theory to human development. So Charles Darwin said this is what evolution is, this is how it works. And the eugenicists took it one step further and said, we should take evolution, apply it to ourselves, so that we can advance the human species, advance the human biology. And the language about, in the definition about racial qualities, that has a slightly different sound to us today. You hear racial qualities. It's not talking about like race as in what we would think of as racism necessarily today. Rather, the racial qualities that they're referring to are more like genetic qualities, what we would think of as genetic qualities. So the goal of eugenics was to enhance human genetics through rational artificial selection, as opposed to the Darwinian idea of natural selection. You just let things go and some changes happen and then evolution happens kind of in a scattershot type method. They're saying, no, that's much too inefficient. We need to advance human evolution through artificial selections, through making rational choices about who has children, who does not have children, things like that. Now, one other comment about this definition. It's talking about the social agencies that control social agencies that may improve or impair the racial or genetic quality of future generations. This gets at the difference between positive and negative eugenics. So positive eugenics was the idea of improving the human evolution or human genetic quality. That idea of improving is positive eugenics, promotes superior qualities, whereas negative eugenics seeks to discourage inferior qualities. So the language about impairing the racial makeup or the racial qualities of future generations. Negative eugenics sought to make sure that inferior qualities, mental, physical qualities, were not handed down to the next generation. So there's kind of a difference there. And then one other comment I would have about this idea of eugenics. One thing that when you're kind of studying about eugenics, they'll say, oh, eugenics is this discredited science. And in many ways, how eugenicists understood their field, it does have a lot of scientific inaccuracies about it. However, eugenics was much more broadly thought than just a narrow science. If you see this eugenic tree again in the image of the logo for the second International Eugenics exhibition, the logo has it so that there are many different roots going into that eugenic tree. And if you read on there, there's all kinds of different roots. Genetics, sociology, mathematics and statistics, anthropology, even religion. All these were different roots that contributed to the eugenic effort to increase or enhance the human population genetically. So eugenics from the very beginning was always thought of as interdisciplinary. In other words, it drew on many different disciplines, not only scientific ones, but what we would consider more in the humanities, politics, sociology, things like that. So eugenics was always very broad-based in its application, not just thinking narrowly in terms of scientific terms. Now, what were some of the eugenic practices that the eugenicists advocated for to promote the superior qualities in man and to discourage the inferior qualities, mental and physical qualities in man? Well, eugenicists sought much legislation, essentially. They sought to change marriage laws so that only superior people who were thought of as superior could marry, and inferior people were disallowed from marriage. Segregation and institutionalization. So if you're thought to be of a lesser kind of mental or moral or physical quality, they could even segregate you into an institution, gender-segregated institutions, to spend the rest of your life. It even went as far as things like the legalization of sterilization and birth control, So forced sterilization is a reality that the eugenicists pushed for, and they actually got this in our nation, the United States, as well as other nations. Francis Galton, being English or British, he kind of started there, but eugenics, this ideology of eugenics, it spread all over the world, and England and the United States were kind of the two biggest players on the eugenic scene in the first half of the 1900s. Even some eugenicists advocated for euthanasia, like I was talking about. These inferior type people, they advocated euthanizing. Now, eugenic legislation never got that far, not in the United States. It did get that far in Nazi Germany, let's say, during World War II. The Nazis did euthanize people who they considered mentally and physically inferior. It didn't get that far in the United States, although some doctors did openly talk about euthanizing disabled infants at birth, but it was a passive euthanization, so they just did not take care of the child and let them die. Although it was never officially practiced, it was kind of maybe practiced under the rug, shall we say. But what ended up happening with all these different eugenic practices is that essentially it mostly ended up just targeting who the eugenicists thought of as inferior, right? Because the idea of positive eugenics is that you promote the superior traits, whereas negative eugenics, you discourage the inferior traits. Well, most all of these eugenic practices disproportionately affected who they thought were inferior physically, mentally, and so on. The image there of that family pedigree is a very influential family tree of a man named Martin Cattlecat. And this was supposedly scientific proof for the theory of eugenics, which Martin Cattlecat had. He had a lawful wife who was decent and upright and upstanding in the community. They had many children, and they were all healthy. See the N in the squares and the circles there of his children, that means normal, whereas the F means feeble-minded or lower intelligence. And so Martin had a adulterous relation with someone during the Revolutionary War who was considered to be feeble-minded there on his right, the F with that relation. And so there he had a son who was considered to be feeble-minded. That son then also had children, many children, and so you have these two branches of the Cattlecat family tree from Martin. And the normal branch was considered kind of this high-grade, high-quality family, whereas the degenerate branch, it was considered more feeble-minded, and it was considered scientific proof at the time of the theory of eugenics. And there were many other studies. This was just one of the famous ones, the Cattlecat study. And Cattlecat simply means, it comes from the Greek, it means good, bad. So I don't believe Cattlecat was actually this man's last name, but they gave him this name meaning good, bad, to show his good family line and his bad family line, kind of to give scientific proof. Now, these studies were far from scientific, how they considered someone abnormal or inferior. It was very subjective, but nonetheless, this was what was considered kind of this cutting-edge science of the early 1900s. And, with the discovery of Mendel's work about genetics and how you cross one pea plant with another pea plant and you get these different genetic characteristics, they thought, things like feeble-mindedness, what they called feeble-mindedness, mental disability, we might say today, they believed that something like that was just passed down, in this very kind of rigid genetic manner, like in Mendel's studies. All right, so like I said, these eugenic practices, they mostly targeted the inferior, those who are considered inferior. So who did the eugenicists consider inferior? We can go to the next slide, please. Broadly speaking, there were three classes that eugenicists focused on to a greater or lesser degree. The first was non-white people, then the disabled, either mentally or physically, and lastly, the economically poor or financially poor were also thought to be inferior by the eugenicists. Now, in our modern context, we see the racism there, especially with considering people who are non-white to be inferior. But this was, at the time, this was kind of standard scientific reasoning. And in that image I have there is kind of the evolutionary progression of man, which we're all familiar with, that icon of Darwinian evolution where a monkey evolves into a man. But here, this was from Ernst Haeckel, the most prominent German biologist of his day. He was like the Charles Darwin of Germany. So Haeckel had this evolutionary progression from monkey to man, except it included race. So the monkey evolves into a black man, evolves into an Aboriginal man, natives of like Australia, evolves into an Asian man, evolves into the white Northwestern European man. So this concept of evolution was openly racist at the time, something that we find quite foreign today. But anyway, eugenicists used this type of scientific information to justify targeting these different groups as inferior. So next slide, please. Now, as you can see, this whole idea is very dangerous of Darwinian evolution, and when combined with eugenic type thinking. And there is historical merit for this. You might have heard of the Scopes monkey trial. Who here has heard of the Scopes monkey trial? Okay, you have heard of it, I can assure you. Is the debate over evolution being taught in public schools. And this is 1925 when this trial occurred. So John Scopes was a high school teacher who was called on to teach a biology course in which it was taught of the human evolutionary ancestor. It goes back to primates, monkeys. And so the issue at hand was whether or not he could legally teach this in a public school classroom. And of course, we know evolution eventually won the day. It's not even an issue anymore. It's just what's taught in our public school classrooms. But there was this legal case back in 1925 where it's called the Scopes, this kind of pejoratively referred to as the Scopes monkey trial. Now, the person who was bringing the complaint against Scopes for teaching evolution was William Jennings Bryan. And if you ever read or watch anything on this trial, William Jennings Bryan is kind of pictured as this backwater, hickish, he's like a creationist. He doesn't know, he's not smart, he's not intelligent, kind of. Actually, he was a very intelligent, very accomplished man, and he even assisted the president as an official within the president's, I believe it was President Wilson. Anyway, so he was this kind of a very accomplished man, and he had legitimate concerns about the teaching of evolution in the public school because he was concerned about this whole idea about the survival of the fittest mentality that Darwinian evolution taught, especially for those most vulnerable. He was concerned about the vulnerable and what this would do for them. And he was concerned specifically about the link between evolution and eugenics. And his concern was not without merit, because the very biology textbook that John Scopes, the teacher, was using in his high school classroom explicitly advocated for applying eugenic theory, in applying eugenic principles. So William Jennings Bryan had a legitimate concern about the teaching of evolution in the public school classroom. And please feel free to interrupt with any questions at any time. We'll advance to the next slide, please. All right, so the American Eugenics Society was established, was a society established to popularize this notion of eugenics within kind of the popular thinking. And they had many different ways of doing this. They had these fitter family contests where you would go and go to like a state fair, and much like you would have a pig or a cow judged based on its looks and its abilities and things like that, they would judge your family based on your family's eugenic fitness, how many kind of superior mental, physical qualities your family had, and they would win a blue ribbon if you were found to be the fittest eugenic family. And then, there'd be runner-up, second place, third place, things like this. Just like you give a blue ribbon to a cow or a pig, they had these eugenic fitter family contests, and they're pictured as a winner from the 1925 Kansas State Fair. Look how eugenically fit that family looks. So they did things to popularize the ideas of eugenics, like having these contests. They even had a sermon writing contest. So remember how I said eugenics, it pulled on all different fields. It wasn't just biology, it was also things like religion. So the American Eugenics Society had a cash prize contest where pastors were invited to write sermons advocating for implementing eugenics in our American society. And they had multiple of these contests. The first one had this question, this is what you're supposed to preach on: religion and eugenics. Does the church have any responsibility for improving the human stock? And of course, that sounds like an open-ended question, but they're really looking for a sermon that answer that question in the positive. In other words, yes, the church does have the responsibility for improving the human stock. All right, let's take a look at the next organization, the Eugenic Record Office. Whereas the American Eugenics Society was focused on popularizing the idea of eugenics, the Eugenic Record Office, established in 1910 with money from large donors like the Rockefeller family, the Carnegie family, things like people like that. The Eugenic Record Office was focused more on the science side of things, the scientific research side of things. And Charles Davenport, pictured there, he was the primary researcher at the Eugenic Records Office, so he focused more on the biology side of things. And Harry Laughlin, he focused on the legislative side of things. So this is kind of where the political activism comes in. And he did things like he was an expert witness, an expert eugenic witness before Congress in advocating for restricting immigration from areas of the world like Eastern Europe, Southern Europe. So your Polish people, your Italian type people. He advocated for the restriction of immigration from those parts of the world because they were thought to be eugenically inferior. And his recommendations were by and large taken. And so in 1924, the Immigration Act of 1924 severely limited immigration from basically non-Northwestern European parts of the world to the United States. Also, probably where Harry Laughlin had the most impact of all is in writing a model sterilization bill. I talked about forced sterilization was one of the methods for weeding out the inferior type people from the human race. So this model sterilization bill he wrote as a way of having states adopt the practice of forced sterilization for those they deemed inferior in a way that was legally defensible. Now, you could say, well, that's not morally defensible. No, it's not morally defensible, but in a way that was legally. So there's a difference between moral and legal, we understand as Christians here. Sometimes the government tells us to do things that we simply cannot do because God's word is clear. But anyway, so he published this model sterilization bill, and interestingly, many states used it, and in order to do this legally, And it was so successful in the States that Germany picked up on this in 1933, and the Nazis they used the model sterilization bill that Harry Laughlin published to pass their own sterilization law, and then the Nazis just went and ran with that. And so usually if people have heard of eugenics, they know of it from its association with Nazism and World War II era practices of the Nazis, especially exterminating the weak and such. But it all started here with Laughlin and the Eugenic Records Office publishing this sterilization bill. Germany just picked up the ball and ran with it. Kind of an interesting historical side note there. Yeah, Alan.
Is there a model sterilization bill passed?
Yeah, many states adopted it, as we will see. So if you go to the next slide. So again, the eugenicists were looking for a way to legally perform sterilizations because they didn't want to get in trouble with the law. They didn't want this to be found to be illegal because that would ruin their eugenic goal, right? So they had a test case in this young woman, Kerry Buck. Kerry Buck was institutionalized for being feeble-minded. We might say mentally disabled today, but their term for it was feeble-minded, in the Virginia colony for epileptics and feeble-minded. One of the things that could get you labeled feeble-minded is if you were considered to be immoral. And so Kerry Buck, now, according to Kerry Buck's own testimony, she was actually raped by she was adopted, so it would be her cousin, but through adoption. So a cousin raped her. Okay, so you see the gears of injustice turning here and crushing those who are innocent. Anyway, Kerry Buck was considered a good test case by the eugenicists because she was admitted to this colony for epileptics and feeble-minded, as well as her mother, Emma. So Kerry and her mother, Emma, were both admitted to this colony, as well as Kerry's daughter, right? She was admitted pregnant, but she had the child, and it was this daughter, I believe her name was Vivian. The workers there, at only 6 or 7 months old, they diagnosed her daughter Vivian as eugenically inferior and feeble-minded at only a few months old. So for the eugenicists, it was this kind of ironclad case because they could demonstrate how the mother, the daughter, and the granddaughter were all feeble-minded. So it gave credence to what they were saying about the inferior pass on their inferior genes, their inferior traits to the next generation. So eventually, Kerry was in fact sterilized, along with many members of her family who were also institutionalized there. However, they were not informed of the procedure. In fact, Kerry's sister, Doris, she said that they told her she had an appendectomy, but really they had sterilized her. And then she found this out later in life and why she couldn't have children and all of that. Now, so this case, Kerry Buck's sterilization, it went all the way to the Supreme Court. So we can go to the next slide. It was tested in the Supreme Court. It was found to be legal under the United States Constitution. And the case was Buck versus Bell, 1927. And this is what Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes had to say about Kerry Buck's sterilization in his majority opinion. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. And then he cites the vaccination case there. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So this is the majority opinion of a United States Supreme Court case. And again, you see the wheels of injustice crushing the innocent, who the eugenicists considered inferior. So forced sterilizations was ruled by the Supreme Court to be legal. And they're basing it on this whole idea that you can compel someone to get a vaccine. You can also compel them to be sterilized. So Holmes saw a connection there. And then this opened up the floodgates for other states, because this was in Virginia. So other states then passed these forced sterilization laws legally. And something like at least 65,000 American citizens were sterilized in the last century of our nation. Buck versus Bell has never been legally overturned, and the laws, the sterilization laws that were based on Buck versus Bell, it took until the 70s and 80s for them to be finally removed from the books. So we were still sterilizing people into the 70s and 80s in this nation because of eugenic unfitness. By the way, Buck versus Bell, you see the bad legacy here. Buck versus Bell was cited, I believe it was cited in the abortion Roe versus Wade Supreme Court case as well, to justify abortion. So you begin to see a connection here, but we'll get more into that in a future study. I think that's all I have. If you could just go to the next slide. Oh yeah, there's some books on the topic if you're interested. But so that's a bit of a brief introduction to eugenics. Just laying the historical groundwork for that. Now, if I will circle back to my opening devotion on 1 Corinthians, but are there any questions before I do that, or any observations?
I can remember years ago, institutionalized was, it was part of life. Madison, Mendota, I think everybody knew what it was, and I didn't know that they were carrying on this sort of thing, but it doesn't seem like there is so much of that institutionalization today.
Yeah, I think institutionalizations have decreased, and the thinking has changed on that. But if you go back one slide, you can see Wisconsin. There were 33 states that passed these sterilization laws. Wisconsin was one of them. Now, there were some states that were bigger offenders, like Virginia sterilized thousands of people. California, I think, was the biggest one in terms of the number of sterilizations performed, but North Carolina had a lot. But 33 states had these laws on the books. So if you were put in one of these institutions in Wisconsin, you might have been sterilized also. It was possible.
There was one of the Kennedy family that was institutionalized in Wisconsin that no one knew about at the time, but
that's right, yeah.
later, after the president's assassination, some of those things started to come out.
Yeah, it was JFK's sister, I believe, was in Wisconsin. That's right. Well, that kind of lays the historical foundation for our topic. One thing that I want to do is dive a little bit more into where the eugenics movement has gone since the early 1900s. We saw Buck versus Bell is 1927, and so it seems like eugenics was on the rise in the 1920s and the 1930s. But things changed, and we'll get into what happened with eugenics after, especially after World War II, and the revelation of what the Nazis had done in the concentration camps and things like that, with this eugenic thinking in mind. So we'll get into that a little bit more, and then also kind of a biblical response. But just to circle back to the very beginning, the biblical response, being 1 Corinthians 1:26, not many of you were eugenic, right? Not many of you were well-born. Paul actually uses this word in 1 Corinthians. So this whole idea about being eugenically born or having a good birth, having these superior mental, physical qualities, that's all blown to pieces by our Lord Jesus Christ, who doesn't choose us based on our superior qualities or traits, but rather he chooses us in spite of us being weak, in spite of us being foolish, in spite of us being not nobly born, not having a good birth, right? So this is Christianity. And so this whole idea that Christianity and eugenics are somehow compatible is laughable, but nonetheless, the eugenicists tried to mesh the two, and they had some success. They really did. And we can talk about that in a future, we'll talk about that next week more. So.